Right. So my talk today is about vulnerabilities, and Adam, thank you, Adam. I don't know if he's still here, but anyway, Adam was talking about how vulnerabilities that were discovered in the past have a tendency to hang around, linger on, maybe in a slightly different form. Now, at Secura, we love taking a look at these vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are from all times. You obviously know the Trojan horse, which is a human vulnerability, right? It's still a security vulnerability, but it's more human vulnerability. In the middle, I always like this one, and you'll see the relevance in a minute. The middle picture is a blue box. And a blue box is a little device that was used, I think, for the first time in the 70s. And it's used by hackers to hack the phone system. Now, when you normally dial a number, you know, you have these sounds for a 1, for a 2, for a 3, and etc. And these sounds tell the phone system what number you're dialing. DTMF tones, they are called. But the exchanges, phone exchanges between themselves, they talk a similar language, at least they used to. Also by sounds, just different frequency tones. And you could generate these tones yourself and hack the system using it, because the phone switch would think that you were another phone switch, so you could tell it to do all kinds of operator calls and other things. So phone hacking was one of the earliest forms of hacking, and it's still of lots of interest. Now, the current interest in security goes often to stuff like web applications and cloud security, but this whole phone system is still out there, and it's often overlooked. And we are looking at it at Secura together with one of my interns. We'll get to that in a minute. And of course, we have scams and hacks going on, cryptocurrencies. Of course, I love cryptocurrencies, don't get me wrong, but there are also some scams like BitConnect coming along. And I don't know if you know who this guy is. This is one of my favorite stories about phishing and how you get people to and scamming. This supposedly is the Nigerian astronaut Abacha Tunde. So the setup is like this. You'll get an email. You know the Nigerian scamming emails, except this one is that this Nigerian astronaut has been up there in space for 20 years, and he's stuck in his space station, and he has about $20 million in back pay from his salaries, but we can't get him back. They can only pay him when he's back on Earth. So if you give us money now, we can send up a rocket and get him back, and just give us money, and then when he's back, we'll give you millions. Right. Great story. Vulnerabilities, this again is a human vulnerability. There are technical vulnerabilities. We find them a lot. You can find them yourself. For instance, I don't know if any of you have ever played around with a website called Shodan. So Shodan is a scanning engine. It's like Google, but not for web pages and information, but for systems. So you can go into Shodan and type a query and say, I want to see all, I don't know, Synology, NASes on the internet that you know about, and it'll give you a list. Or find me all the open web interfaces for shopping mall lighting systems. Yep, you can do that, and you'll find this. So I did a bit of Googling. What is the Yoho Mall? Well, it's a big shopping mall in Hong Kong, and you can control the lights, no password, anything. It's just open on the internet, quite vulnerable. Don't play around with it. Just having a vulnerability, though, is not something in itself that's bad. I mean, we're all vulnerable in some way. For something bad to happen, you need a few other things. You'll need an actor, someone who abuses that vulnerability. This actor must have a motivation. And since it costs energy to abuse or exploit a vulnerability, he must have the means to do this. So it's a bit like crime. There they talk about the opportunity, the motive, and the means. Well, it's the same here. We have a vulnerability, an actor, the motivation, and the means. And when you add all those, then it could lead to an exploit, loss of business, In some cases, it could even lead to loss of life, espionage, or other hacks. And vulnerabilities are, of course, of all times. This is a little graph. I often use this report as a reference. It's from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. If you don't know that report, I would encourage you to go and take a look at it. You can download it for free on the internet. They publish, Verizon does, every year a paper analyzing all the data breaches that have taken place in the last year, and they get their information from Interpol, but also from victims of cybercrime, both large corporations, small corporations, data leaks, and all kinds of stuff. And they analyze a lot of these things, and the motivation is interesting, because they found that 89% of all breaches had a financial or espionage motive. This includes the smaller breaches, the shops at the end of the street that got hacked. It's all financial these days, because if you install a piece of malware, you can use that in a botnet that you can use to perform a DDoS attack that you can then use to as a decoy when you're doing something else. So everything these days in this sphere has a financial motive. Also interesting to note is, where is it coming from? Is it an external threat or internal threat? Well, it's either external or internal. Partners and collusion is a very, very small percentage of the means with which they actually exploit these vulnerabilities. And what does this lead to? Well, the first thing to take into account is that everything is connected, right? These days, we have a lot of attacks that are combinated. So the Bangladeshi hack was a combination of exploiting insecure software, plus having bad credentials, plus a phishing attack, plus several other things, and it all led to the theft of $80 million. I'm sure you heard of that, through a compromised SWIFT payment terminal. So you'd think that all banks would be, secured against that now. Unfortunately, just last week, the Chilean bank announced that, although they denied it in the first case, they were robbed of $10 million a couple of days ago. How? Well, the hackers, first of all, they performed a malware attack that crashed all the workstations by overwriting the master boot record of all the PCs. So the bank thought, oh, we're being attacked. It's a ransomware that's gone wrong, whatever they thought. But in reality, it was a decoy. In reality, the hackers were not doing a ransomware attack at all. They were actually hacking the SWIFT payment gateway, and they got away with 10 million. So it's changing this threat landscape. As I mentioned, at Secura, we really like to find vulnerabilities. That's what we do. We are in offensive security. We try to find vulnerabilities for our clients. And we're doing that continuously. We find some big ones, and we find many small vulnerabilities. Now, in some cases, or actually in a lot of cases, these are vulnerabilities in applications that our customers and clients have had made for them. So we'll inform our customers, and hopefully they can fix their problems. But in some cases, the problems we find are not related to a custom application, but they're actually related to systems, devices, and larger environments. So I'm going to talk today about some of these issues that we find. It's not something we get to talk about a lot, because most of our customer details are, of course, completely confidential. However, when we have to reach out to the vendors to have it fixed, yeah, at some point in time there will be a patch available and we can start talking about these things. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples of vulnerabilities in systems that we've found recently, and how we dealt with the responsible disclosure process there, the patches that were released, and warning customers by the vendors, of course. We warn our own customers, but we can't warn everyone, of course. So, 3 examples. So the first one that I want to talk about quickly is we thought it would be a good idea to take a look at all the SSL TLS certificates on all the websites and basically all the servers in the Netherlands. So what we did was we found the IP addresses that are in the Netherlands. We scanned all of them, and for every open port that had an HTTPS server, whatever it is, we downloaded the public certificate. So basically you open an HTTPS connection, but you don't send any request, you don't ask for the web page, you just download the certificate. And in the certificate, there is the public key of the entity that you're connecting with. So within the IP space of the Netherlands, we found about 500,000 certificates, so 500,000. And we did some analysis on those. We found that about half were not even valid. So that means they were not given out by a trusted certification authority, or expired, or whatever other reason there is. So that means that half of the users of security technology don't use the security technology correctly, or they don't care, or whatever, but it's just not used correctly. That means half are vulnerable, right, already. Then we analyzed it a bit more, and we found out that luckily the certificates that were given out, 88% were 2048-bit certificates. That's good. Yeah. 1024 is not considered secure anymore, but there's still well over 10% of certificates that are being used that have this 1024-bit key length. And there's also even a few that have less than 1024 bits, but that's just a handful. Nevertheless, I mean, it still means that of the 500,000 that are even valid, another 10% are insecure because they don't use a long key length. 1024 bits, how practical is it to crack those? Well, that's debatable. We're not able to crack them by brute forcing, but there's a couple of weaknesses in the RSA keys that you can abuse that can lead to compromise, and I'll get to that in a minute. Another interesting metric to look at the certificates is what kind of hashing algorithms are used in these certificates. Hashing algorithms over time have been known to be insecure. The most insecure one is MD5. You can crack that with in a couple of seconds on Amazon cluster if you have enough money. It doesn't even cost that much, really, to be honest. SHA-1 can be cracked, maybe not as practical as it will be in the future. But the only secure one that we consider secure at the moment is the SHA-2 family of hashing algorithms. So again, another 20% of certificates that is insecure of the 50% that are considered secure because they're actually valid certificates. So in the end, you end up with only like 35 to 40% of all the certificates in the Netherlands being secure. Now, the RSA algorithm with SHA-256 is the most popular. And RSA is a crypto algorithm that uses public keys and private keys. And the public keys, it's not exactly like that, but basically they consist of two large random prime numbers. If you multiply those two random prime numbers, you get a really long number. And if you were able to actually factorize that large number into its two constituent primes, then you would have cracked the key. So how do we do this? Well, in practice, it turns out that generating random numbers on a computer is actually very difficult. Computers are deterministic things, so they will have to have a source of randomness so that you can generate random numbers. And there's all kinds of ways that computers do this. They, for instance, they measure the time in between keystrokes of users, or they measure mouse movements, or spin-up times of hard disks, or latency on networks. And all these things, they are not really random in themselves. They are even influenceable. A piece of malware could influence all these sources of randomness and maybe make the system generate less random primes. And of course, if a machine is just switched on, it might not have enough randomness in it, collected, entropy we call that, and it could lead to bad random numbers. Now, since the public keys are a product of two prime numbers, if two of these long keys share a prime number, that would be the greatest common denominator, in Dutch de grootste gemene deler. And you can find these using an algorithm developed by this old guy from 2,000 years ago called Euclid. And you can go on to a site called factorable.net and download software that does this. They've done this for the worldwide set of certificates many years ago. But strangely enough, this method of cracking certificates has not really, gained a lot of traction. Many people that read the original research, who of you have heard of that research from a couple of years ago? One hand? Wow. Yeah, just a few people, handful. So that means that if you gather all the certificates and compare them to each other and try to find these greatest common denominators, not one by one, but in a batch, you'll end up with a number of certificates that share primes because they were not random enough. Now, if they were truly random, there would be no chance of finding these collisions of these hashes. Sorry, not the hashes, of the prime numbers. So we did it for the Dutch IP space, and we compared all the Dutch SSL TLS certificates to the worldwide set. Now, you might think, where did you get that worldwide set from? Well, that was pretty easy. There's a company out there called Census, and they have a site called scans.io. You can go on there, create an account, and download a couple of gigabytes file of all the SSL certificates in the world. And we compared the Dutch set to the world set, and we were able to crack 113 certificates. Now, these were all 1024-bit certificates, and they belong to devices. Devices mostly from Fortinet, Cisco, D-Link, and Netgear. And these devices belong to schools, a province, a veiligheidsregio, some IT companies, and others. So they were like Netgear SSL VPN appliances. And these things were shipping, apparently, out of the box with insecure software, generating random, non-random, but supposedly random, prime numbers for the keys. Now, when we found this, although it was not a new finding, because the guys from factorable.net had done that research a couple of years ago already, but this was new for the Netherlands, so we figured we'd inform a couple of vendors. Most vendors didn't even react. Netgear did. They were quite responsive, but these devices apparently are all end of life or nearly end of life. They're not supported anymore. No firmware patches will be issued for these devices. So probably no action. But still, these devices are out there, and that means that with a vulnerable certificate, what can I do? Well, I can crack the certificate. I get the private key. That means two things. I can, if I have a man in the middle position, I can decrypt the communication to that site. And if there's a username and password being typed in there, I can decrypt that, I can find it, and then I can use that information to log in to the system. Or I can impersonate, I can spoof that site. And the HTTPS browser, well, it won't be able to tell the difference between that certificate and the real certificate, so I can impersonate that site and do all kinds of other attacks. We provided with the NCSC with details, IP addresses, and owner-authority vulnerable devices, and that's really where we stopped with our research. The risk is low. It's not a high-risk thing, this. Why not? Well, the certificates were not trusted anyway, because all 113 that we cracked were invalid certificates anyway. Nevertheless, we plan to do this every year, and maybe next year we'll give you an update on this. Now, we wrote a research paper about this with a lot more statistics and how we did it, and a lot more background. If you leave your email address at our booth over there after my talk, or in the coffee break, then we'll email you the white paper. It'll be released next week, and then you can read it at your leisure. All right. Next example. So, in security, we have a class of vulnerabilities called, and these are the worst kinds, it's called remote code execution. Basically, you have a device or a piece of software, and you can manipulate this in such a way that you can trick it into executing software for you that is under your control. So you can send it a command, and it'll do it for you. Now, it's the worst kind of hack that you can have. So during a penetration test, we found a storage appliance from a large vendor. And doing some research on this and looking at the system, we found that this system had some default credentials, basically hidden accounts with fixed passwords. It had remote code execution flaws and many other flaws. I'm not going to go into details about the vendor. It wasn't a small home Synology thing. It was an actual big storage thing. So this was actually quite a serious critical bug. So we notified the vendor, and we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and finally there was a patch, but it didn't really contain any details about what it was patching. It just said, this is a critical patch, you have to install this. And this was after 7 months, right? Which is way too long. Now, we can't even determine at this point in time whether all the stuff we found is patched in this patch, because not enough information was released by the vendor. They did not communicate with us, even though they have on their website a responsible disclosure page stating, yes, we take every security vulnerability that you tell us, we take it seriously, blah, 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 and we'll coordinate a release with you. Well, they didn't. They were just sitting there, I don't know, twiddling their thumbs. I have no idea. They supposedly had a responsible disclosure policy, but they didn't follow their own policies. And to be honest, we're following up now through the NCSC again, because the vendor is non-responsive and the risk is high to critical, because several hundreds of these devices can be found on Shodan, right? And these are presumably, well, they're not cheap devices, so I presume that they will actually be used and not just sit on the internet for nothing. And like Adam said, the vendors, they might patch something, but it's 2018. You would expect vendors by now to be used to this kind of interaction with the security companies that do the research, with hackers that find stuff, right? But the truth is that that just does not always happen. All right. On to my third example. I showed you a picture of that blue box in my introduction slide. What I didn't mention then was that is actually how I got into hacking back in the 80s, right? So I got involved with a group of people, and one of them showed me that you couldn't just hack, computers. You could hack the phone system. How? Well, he'd made a piece of software to generate these tones and make phone calls. And one of the things that we'd enjoy was to call up numbers in strange countries, make the operator think that we were the operator in Amsterdam, and have them patch us through to, I don't know, the White House switchboard, and have a bit of fun with the operator there. And this worked for a long, long time. Up into the 90s, it was still possible to freak, because we call that phreaking, phone phreaking, freak in those ways. And basically what the problem was, why was this possible? It was that the signaling path, so the voice path was connected to this signaling path, and you could access it through the phone, just by audio, by playing these tones into the phone with this device, beep, beep, beep. You could tell the switch to do something that it shouldn't be doing, because it thought you were another switch. And then during the 90s, what happened was that the phone systems got replaced, and it was replaced with a signaling system called Signaling System 7, CCITT 7. This is still used. Now we know that that system is very vulnerable also, but that's not what this is about. For a long time, you couldn't access SS7. It was just a very closed signaling network between country operators, between telephony operators, and as a hacker, no chance of accessing that. That put an end, effectively, to phreaking in the Netherlands. But along comes TCP/IP, and along comes 4G and VoIP. And suddenly, the end user now has access again to this signaling path because it's TCP/IP and it's protocols we know. It's SIP, it's VoIP. We have software implementations of that. We can play around with it again. So, we did. SIP is like HTTP. It has a command like call someone. This is the invite command. Or message someone. That's the message command. And you'll send it some headers, just like a HTTP command to get a web page. It'll have a response. It'll have some header settings there, information in there, and it can be used for voices, text, and multimedia. It's not just calling anymore. This is in what they call an integrated messaging system, IMS. So I have an intern working at us, Barry Bussers. Don't know if he's in here somewhere. Barry? Yep. Hi, Barry. And he's researching this topic together with us. And we already have quite a few cool findings. So in some cases, it's possible to spoof SMSs or actually replay them. So you see an SMS being sent out, you grab that data, and you can replay it on the network from a different phone. And it will appear to be coming from the original phone. That's one thing. A lot of the encryption technology that's being used on voice over 4G is actually determined by the handset. And you can go onto your handset and switch off the encryption layer in some cases, and giving easy access to a hacker to these voice over LTE, because VoLTE is the name for that, the official name. And there's even possibilities of information leakage. including location data of the phone. Not your phone, no, the phone that you're talking to. So you can call up someone and you can find out where they are. Right? That's not good. If you look at Adam's talk, he had to sign up someone to this location service using spoofed SMSs. And this was back in 2006, I believe, that video was from. And here we are, 12 years later, basically with the same problems, right? Being able to track users, being able to hack their phones. And there's even a couple of possibilities using these technologies to share SIM cards. Because what happens is, if you have a phone that is using this 4G, voice over 4G system, first the SIM card authenticates to the network and you get a data connection. But that does not mean that you're already authenticated to use the voice communication. So what the phone does when you open up the dialer, it authenticates to the VoIP network. And the VoIP, the SIP server, will challenge the handset. This challenge will get sent to the SIM card. The SIM card does a cryptographic operation on that challenge and sends the answer back. And only if that is correct, then you can then your SIP session is authenticated and you can start to make phone calls. But the authentication to the network, so the radio network, and the authentication to the SIP server are two completely different things. I can take another phone, authenticate to the radio network using a SIM card, but then when I make a phone call and I get that challenge, if I have a piece of software sitting on that phone that sends that challenge not to my SIM card, but over a different channel to another phone, and their SIM card gets the answer and sends it back, then I can authenticate to the SIP network as though I'm another user. So all it takes is a piece of malware on your phone, and someone could be using your SIM card to make phone calls on your costs, but also posing as you. So this is a possibility of SIM card sharing. It's not a very new technology, this card sharing thing. I mean, satellite hackers have been doing this for years, right? So you have a Canal Digital subscription, for instance, and you have the smart card sitting in your satellite receiver, and someone else you can share that card with someone else. The software for that, you can do that. And this is the same attack, basically, on the phone level, using SIP and VoIP. Now, I'm not saying this is possible with every telephony provider, but these are weaknesses that definitely exist. We've contacted the telcos. Not everyone is as responsive, but the worst issues have been fixed already now. The SIM card sharing thing is more of a protocol thing, so it will not be possible to prevent that. That's just the way the system works. So that weakness has to be solved by detection measures. So if you can't solve it by prevention, then of course you'll have to try to detect it and do something about it that way. So we've given some recommendations to do the detection and find out if people are abusing this, but we haven't had a large response on that yet. All right, so that's 3 examples of how, even in 2018, it's difficult to get attention from the vendors. Well, what we see a lot with other vulnerabilities that are found, they're hyped and then dumped. Right? I don't know if well, I'm sure you've heard of the meltdown and specters and heartbleeds and, well, basically, if a vulnerability has a logo and a bloody web page, then you can pretty much assume that it's being hyped and being dumped without, well, some do proper due course, but we've seen a lot of examples recently where vulnerabilities have just been disclosed too fast, too slow, and with not enough coordination with the vendors, and the vendors have not been coordinating with their customers, right? And this is not helping anyone, really. So I really want, if there are any vendors here in the audience today, please talk also to your marketing guys how engaging with the security industry, with companies like us, and with the hackers is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, right? We're there to help everyone make everything more secure. And we also would like to show that, just finding these vulnerabilities, you cannot find large vulnerabilities just during a pen test. Sometimes these bits of research, Barry has been doing this research now for over half a year, right? It takes time, it takes skills. It doesn't happen during a five-die pen test. Longer research is necessary, yeah? And testing should also include source code analysis. If you want to target the systems and the people using those systems and the processes using those systems, you're not going to do that with a pen test. So you should look at it broader. Red teaming, maybe even start at the beginning, security by design. In 2018, I would have hoped that things had changed from 2006, but unfortunately, many times they have not yet. This concludes my talk.
Thank you very much, Rolf Moonen.
Thanks.